All right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the Business Architecture Forum broadcast. Just a real quick disclaimer before we get started, the webinar is being recorded for the purposes of sharing and collaborating with those who are not able to join, or for those who want to be able to review later. So if you would like to not be recorded, we would encourage you to please feel free to go ahead and use the chat feature. We'll try to make sure that we can get to questions at the end. And before we get started, though, I would like to invite Linda Finley to say some quick words before we jump right in. Linda.
Yep, thank you. For all of anyone that doesn't know me, Linda Finley, founder of the Twin Cities Business Architecture Forum, now the Business Architecture Forum, 16 years ago. So here we are. I want to just go over a couple of slides as we get going relative to what Business Architecture Forum is and what TCBF is and what the new Houston community that we're launching is. And then also a word or two that I'll start with now on why we asked Ben Chamberlain to join us. And then we'll reintroduce Ben a little bit later. But for anyone that was participating in the January summit that kicked off this year that we had, you know how important it is for us to be collaborating and co-creating and leaning into our community partners. This is a belief I've had for a long time that business architecture is it's not a silo. It's not a silo. We need each other. We need other disciplines in the organization, and we need to understand and lean into leveraging other disciplines and other functions in the organization. What Ben Chamberlain got off the ground and that I've been helping with as a core member is an organization called Strategy Execution Forum, which he will explain fully, which actually does exactly what I just described. Business architecture, enterprise architecture are part of it, but it also understands that many other corporate strategic aligned disciplines are absolutely essential to bring what we need to bring forward, transformation in organizations. So that's why Ben's here. Is a very important community that's getting off the ground. The Business Architecture Forum and TCBF are very interested in making sure that we have a successful position within it and also help to drive it forward. And that's what Ben's going to be talking about today. It's something that we should all be very interested in and understand the power of. Okay, I'm just going to go through a couple of slides that are background for the Business Architecture Forum. If Jenny, if you want to. So this is not for you to study. It's just something that I want to remind you of. As business architects, we are constantly, or at least frequently, reviewing and re-understanding our business capability model, the alignment we have to business strategy and how we're executing and activating that strategy. So we need to be looking at our business model, the way we're delivering our operating model and our engagement. And so this is just something that we have done as well. This year, next slide, Jenny or Ben. This year, we have leaned hard into creating an umbrella organization or the organization in kind of a new way. And that the Business Architecture Forum, with this motivation statement or this purpose statement that you see here, the Business Architecture Forum is a intentionally global organization where we're delivering this broadcast and one every month, just like it, as well as the podcast that we're doing new this year. So we can reach the digital audience, so we can reach the global audience instead of trying to do everything reach all segments in the same way. And so next slide, I'm sure you have had a chance to read it. I'm not going to read these except for this part. People come to BAF and connect with our local communities, not just to learn, but to engage, to exchange ideas, to apply insights, to publish and share outcomes. We are establishing BAF, where you are right now, in service of local communities. So next week, we're launching a local community in Houston that is is a baby compared to our TCBF community, which has been around for 16 years, but we're getting it off the ground and we're starting it out. We're also leaning towards creating those communities, similar local communities where we can reach people, local, connect, mentor, guide, and relate in a number of other locations. Jenny, if you want to do the last slide for me. And this gets you a little view of our Twin Cities Business Architecture Forum, which has been, as I said, existing for 16 years. Houston is launching next week on the 28th. Anyone in the Houston area that wants to be part of that community, if you know anyone in the Houston area, make sure that they know we are launching in Houston next week. And then we are looking at Kansas City. We are looking at Des Moines. We are looking at something in the Pacific Northwest. And we also have a pretty strong foothold in Toronto, where we have a lot of BBC and IABA presence. So that's the model. You're not unfamiliar with the model, where we have a federated sort of management point, and then we have our local communities that will be delivering hands and feet resources to our community. That's what I wanted to say. You'll get all of this stuff if you go out to the bafcommunities.org website, and which is our tcbf.org website. And Jenny Fox, maybe we can even put in the comments if there are changes. We're right in the process right now of transitioning a lot of our website information to this new model. So as always, I invite you to reach out to me if you want to talk about any of this. We're so happy you're here. I'm so delighted to have been here. And that's it for me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Linda. All right, let's get to our main event. So most organizations don't fail at strategy because they lack ideas. They fail because execution often happens in silos. So after more than 30 years working in the strategy execution space, Ben Chamberlain came to a really simple conclusion. Organizations don't need another framework or tool. They need a connected, C-suite backed approach that brings the enterprise together. So in this session, Ben shares why business architects have a critical role to play and why they can't do it alone, and what it's going to take to turn strategy into execution into a true enterprise capability. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you for having me. You want me to share my screen?
Yes, please.
Okay. Hopefully you see that okay. Yeah. Okay,
Yeah,
well,
we
thanks
sure
for that.
can. Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks for that intro. And let's dive in, right? Good to see some familiar faces on this call. So I'm going to talk about a couple of things. Linda asked me, to come and talk about why I founded the Strategy Execution Forum and what led me to found the forum. And I also wanted then to dive into some of the sort of key challenges I see organizations facing in terms of mastering strategy execution. And then I wanted to surface some of the thinking that's already coming through the Strategy Execution Forum in terms of mastering 10 key principles, or 10 key principles you need to master strategy execution. And we're going to dive deep into a couple of those principles, not all of those principles. So let's dive in. So why did I found the Strategy Execution Forum? So, as Jenny said, I've been in the strategy execution space for far longer than I care to remember. At the forum, we say it takes a village to master strategy execution. And, based on that, it requires different functions and roles to come together. So there's no one person or one consulting organization that knows it all. Now, my focus on strategy execution has more been on the portfolio, program, and project side. So I started my career in the UK as a project manager in the construction industry. I then sort of moved into management consultancy, focused on kind of governance and kind of PMO setup. And I joined a firm in 2002, which had an opinion on what portfolio management could or should be, more than just dashboarding, but how to objectively align investment projects with strategy and using AHP techniques and linear optimization techniques, how to optimize and maximize your investment alignment with the strategy. Over the years, we built technology and framework around that. That got known by Gartner and ended up getting acquired by Microsoft. So I joined the Microsoft team, was heading the product marketing of the Microsoft project family of products, and we integrated and embedded our portfolio management capabilities and toolset into what became Microsoft Project Server and Project Online, which are now legacy products. And then we then spun out of Microsoft around 2010 era to finish the strategic portfolio management journey that we had already envisaged. So we built another product known as UMT 360 Strategic Portfolio Manager, which became recognized by Gartner as one of the leading strategic portfolio management offerings and featured in the Strategic Portfolio Magic Quadrant as well as Enterprise Architecture Magic Quadrants. As again, it touched many domains. So that company was acquired by another organization and a consulting organization that needed technology to compete better with the Big Four. So I integrated the team, the technology with that organization, and then decided what else did I want, or what do I want to do next. So I took some time off, and kind of started to reflect, based on conversations that I had over the last couple of years. And I spent far more time on LinkedIn than I think I ever have in the last sort of 6 to 8 months of my life. And it seemed that a lot of people seem to be frustrated with their organization's ability to execute on strategy. It doesn't matter if it was coming from the architecture side of the house, the sort of project management or portfolio management side of the house. A lot of talk around bridging the gap between strategy execution. And that frustrated me a little bit, thinking I've spent a lot of my life dedicated to this space, but the needle hasn't moved that much collectively for organizations. And of course, there are a lot of metrics out there or statistics that all seem to start with north of 59%, 50%, 70%, 67%, or whatever, suggesting that things are not optimal. So I said, look, if I'm going to stay in this space, then what is the reason that organizations are still struggling to execute on their strategy despite significant process improvements and obviously supporting technology that's been applied over the last 20, 30 years? So I started to think about what are those main reasons. And of course, as you start to peel back layers of the onion, there are many, maybe hundreds of reasons that are holding organizations back. But what are the real three? And I came up with 3 root causes that are contributing to this suboptimal capability. The first was C-suite commitment. I don't think necessarily the C-suite understand what strategy execution is. A lot of times I think it's kind of program management on steroids, and it's much more than that. And they certainly don't understand the amount of business value at risk due to suboptimal strategy execution capabilities. I'm going to dive deeper and highlight some research later that actually quantifies the business value at risk, because it is significant and I don't think it can be ignored. Next, and kind of the underpinning of everything we're doing within the Strategy Execution Forum, is it takes a village to master strategy execution. When you look at most organizations today, obviously there's different critical functions that exist and all need to work together to actually execute an organization's strategy. But as Linda said, there's often silos between these functions, and we often optimize our part of the puzzle or part of the overall machinery, based on our role, sometimes even elevating it to the critical thing. Mastering strategy execution is about having strategy, then architecture, and then execution. Or mastering strategy execution is all about change management because it's about people and culture. Or mastering strategy execution is all about the PMO, or rebranding that to a value management office, or whatever you want to call it, right? And all of that is true, right? But we've got to, when you look at these silos that exist between these critical functions and you aggregate that, what you find is you have a fractured operating model, right? And staying with that kind of value analogy, value kind of seeps through the cracks where these teams and functions should perfectly adjoin. So what we need to do here is get the multiplier effect of bringing these functions together and integrating and optimizing 5 critical capabilities, which are strategic portfolio management, business and enterprise architecture, financial planning and analysis, project execution, of course, change management, to build that cohesive operating model that is geared to maximizing and accelerating business value. Now, last but by no means least of these kind of three big rocks is these one-size-fits-no-one or one-size-fits-all methodologies and frameworks. At least from the project, program, and portfolio management side of the house, it feels like every 10 years a new framework or methodology appears, which is going to solve world hunger and world peace, right? It's going to solve everything the other one didn't deliver upon. And it never does, right? Yes, it takes you to a new destination, but no, you're not the destination that it was saying it was going to get you to in the first place. And there's two reasons for that. One, because these frameworks and methodologies are often optimized for one function, whether that's architecture, whether that's project and portfolio management change, whatever it is, and don't necessarily adequately address the other functions. And the realization is that to successfully deploy a strategy execution capability within the organization, it has to be personalized to the idiosyncrasies and culture and nuances of that organization, right? What works for you in one organization won't necessarily work for you in the next organization. And that is key. So with that in mind, I said to myself, well, what am I going to do next? It seems like an exercise in futility to set up a boutique management consulting firm to try and solve this, right? It definitely seems like an exercise in futility to establish a new software product that's somehow going to solve this. So I said, look, based on that village concept and no one knowing it all, I'm going to create a forum, the Strategy Execution Forum, that brings together multidisciplinary leaders and practitioners to figure out how we can do this better, with the intention of elevating strategy execution to become a C-suite imperative, a critical discipline, enterprise discipline that must be developed across the organization. And to do that needs an enterprise function that becomes the architects of this strategy execution muscle to be able to reclaim this value. We're going to dive into the 10 principles today that's been recently defined by the community, but we want to reject these kind of one-size-fits-all approaches and say, look, there are going to be some pillars or some principles we must achieve if we're going to master strategy execution, but how we achieve it could be different for different organizations. So we're looking to crowdsource through the community and all the practitioners and leaders in the community different approaches for solving each of the principles. The principles I'm going to dive into a little deeper in a moment. So that's how the Strategy Execution Forum came into existence. It is relatively new. We kind of kicked it off in October of last year. Probably didn't really start recruiting, and it's great to see many of the folks that are in the community on the call today. We didn't really start actively recruiting until earlier this year, and we're at what I consider to be an MVP, where we have great representation of the village, the critical functions, architecture being just one of those. And we have good geographical representation, and of course we have good industry representation. So we have that MVP to start to build this collaborative community. And what I'm really focused on is, I could have easily set this up and said, here is my approach that I built in the past and was ratified by Gartner. No, I want this to be a community-driven approach. So we're moving at the speed the community can move to be able to define these 10 principles, then start to capture the best practices and plays and approaches to be able to achieve these principles. Okay, so let's move on. So I want to do an overview of the 10 key principles that have been defined by the community, because it's kind of foundational to what we're going to build upon as a community. Now, these 10 principles can only be achieved by the unification of the village members, the key functions, which architecture is obviously one of the key functions, and the integration and optimization of those 5 critical capabilities that I mentioned earlier: strategic portfolio management, both flavors of architecture, financial planning and analysis, project execution of varied techniques, doesn't have to be one, and of course, change management underpinning it all. So as a community, we said, okay, look, we want to reject this one-size-fits-all approach. So we're going to define 10 key principles to master strategy execution. So what is a principle? A principle is a fundamental truth or universal standard of excellence that serves as a foundation for effective strategy execution, right? It defines what good or even better, what great looks like, and the guiding actions, behaviors need to achieve it. This is the why and the what. We're not getting into the how, right? The hows are going to be the different plays and approaches being used by organizations and our community members, right, to achieve each of the principles. So we're defining, what good looks like to then evaluate different competing approaches, not even competing, alternative approaches to achieving each of these principles. So when we look to the principles, and again, this has gone through a number of iterations over the last few months. So many of you that were with me at the start of this will recognize this. There's still some recognition to what it looked like from the start, but they have been fundamentally blessed and evolved by the community. We're going to go into each of these, certainly the first one in more detail, but just cover each one of them in some level of detail, time permitting. So principle one, how to expose the cost of poor strategy execution. I'm not going to read them all. I'm going to get through each of them. So you'll see the 10 principles here. So let's dive a little deeper into each of the principles. Starting with principle one, expose the cost of poor strategy execution, right? Now, remember, that first core challenge in terms of holding organizations back was C-suite understanding and C-suite commitment. So the whole purpose of this principle is to get C-suite commitment to recognize or elevate strategy execution to be a imperative, which is the tagline for our community, and then to drive that commitment in terms of developing that strategy execution muscle across the organization. So there's two things that we want to do within this principle. First, if we're going to get the C-suite to understand what strategy execution is or see it as an imperative, we better first define what it is, right? In the first place, right? So what are the definitions? So one of the first things we did as a community was look at a definition for strategy execution. This was, again, sourced across all the different roles and functions and members that we have in the community and uses AI to kind of bring this all together. Again, I'm not going to read this out. You can see it on the screen, or maybe I will. Strategy execution is a mission-critical organization, discipline, or capability, one that translates strategic intent to scaled and effective execution. It is the GPS that continuously aligns all investments, operational and discretionary, with strategy, and the connective tissue that unites multidisciplinary functions to execute with precision to maximize business value and outcomes. Now, in the community, we have a short, medium, and full definition. So I just presented the short definition to you here. I highlighted the important part of this for me, which is this isn't just about, this strategy execution isn't just about program management or steroids. It's not just about the discretionary or strategic investments or big bets. It's about all activity and spend. How do we ensure our operational activity and spend, as much as our discretionary or strategic activity and spend, is continuously aligned, optimized with strategy and executed effectively. It's an important differentiator because we want to ensure that we're bringing the village together that represents that combined aggregate investment across the organization. So now, obviously, this needs to be tailored to the specific organization, right? But we need to build a business case or value case to the C-suite that says strategy execution needs to be considered a strategic investment or a critical investment. We also then want, as part of that value case, to be able to quantify the business value at risk. Earlier, I showed this kind of high-level stats. Gartner saying that 70% of the strategic investments are at risk of delivering the intended outcomes. McKinsey saying something similar, or whoever said that 70% of transformations fail. Right? There's all these high-level stats that are kind of opaque. Right? I kind of believe that if we get down to the leading indicators of business value erosion, we can concretely confirm to the executive team how value is being lost and deferred. And how we can actually reclaim and accelerate that lost value through capability improvements across those critical capabilities that I mentioned earlier. So we set about doing some research, and we'll continue to build this out with the community as we speak around quantifying the business value at risk. Now, say for the knowledge that if we can show to the C-suite that there's extensive then they're going to have to do something about it. One of my members said to me once, if we're a manufacturing organization, maybe have a production line, then maybe a bottling plant, and one out of 3 or 1 out of 5 bottles was breaking on that production line, you're going to fix it, right? Exactly the same thing is happening in terms of value erosion through our strategy execution capabilities. So we want to pinpoint the problems so that we can optimize those capabilities and processes to reclaim and accelerate that value. So again, this is evolving. So this is a snapshot as of about two months ago, I would say. So we wanted to assess the leading indicators of business value erosion, right? When I started to look across strategic portfolio management or business or enterprise architecture or project execution or FP&A or change management, quite honestly, there are hundreds of metrics across those disciplines we hold ourselves accountable to, right? But very few of them actually leading indicators to business value erosion. So I'm not saying this is definitive, and Linda and I have some discussions more on the architecture side coming up on this. But I kind of distilled them down, rightly or wrongly, into 2 key categories of risk: portfolio structural risk and portfolio execution risk. You see the kind of metrics here under each category. Now, again, there's an hour's presentation just on both sides here. I'm going to not do it justice, but dive in very quickly to each. So portfolio structural risk is probably the most insidious risk of all, right? It's actually invisible half the time, right? You're not actually aware. It's not really value that's being lost. It's being left on the table. It's kind of an opportunity cost due to suboptimal portfolio planning capabilities and suboptimal architectural capabilities. So when we think about strategic misalignment of initiatives, it's one of the key metrics. Alignment to me is one of the biggest problems still out there. Even though I was building products back in 2002 to help with objectively aligning things with strategy, I still think it's one of the major issues out there that organizations face. So we looked at low performing versus high performing. I'm just going to focus on low performing based on time, right? So when you think about misalignment, what sort of core contributors to misalignment? It's the inability, quite honestly, to effectively translate and communicate strategy across the organization. We'll talk more about that because that's principle 3 in our 10 principles. But really, poor alignment is due to poor portfolio planning techniques, often bottom-up portfolio planning techniques, which we'll touch on again later in this presentation. Which is often the lines of annual planning, but then we also want to move to a continuous planning model where we can rebalance and optimize throughout the year. So what we found was, all those suboptimal capabilities, right, for low-performing organizations, resulting in around 26%, 27% of value being left on the table, which is significant. Next, we move to redundancy and overlap between initiatives. Most organizations don't have that kind of overarching enterprise function that can spot redundancy in investments and initiatives, right? Whether that's an enterprise PMO, transformation office, whatever you want to call it, right? Obviously, immature business and enterprise architecture capabilities make it difficult also to identify redundant investments that may be impacting the same capability or service or whatever it may be. So we looked at that, and I won't get into the underlying math. There's a paper that does that. Now, there's another 7.5% worth of value that is being left on the table, which basically means before you even get going, before you even start executing on your portfolio, you could be leaving around 34% of value on the table, or there's an opportunity cost of value that has not been optimally identified. We then took a look at the operational spend. And what happens if we were able to reallocate that spend or rationalize that spend and redirect it to innovation or growth initiatives? When you think about it, organizations have grown over time, right, through investments or through M&A, which often leads to a bloated business and technical architecture. If you don't have structured business and enterprise architecture capabilities, it's very difficult to visualize and see the whole operating fabric of your business. So organizations with higher performing architectural capabilities and architectural teams can actually save a relatively significant amount of the overall operational budget, not just the technical budget, but the overall operational budget, which includes the business architecture as much as the technical architecture. What we found then is if you're able to save around 9 to 10% of the operational budget through rationalization, then if you redirect that funds to discretionary spend or strategic growth initiatives, you could actually grow your overall discretionary budget by close to 40%, which is significant, right? So I've purposely sort of kept these separate, right? 34% of value as opportunity cost, with the potential to be able to rationalize your operational budget and reallocate to growth initiatives. Okay. So that's portfolio structural risk, right? Now we get into something I think is better understood, which is the portfolio execution risk. Obviously, there's a lot of metrics that confirm this, whether it's the sort of chaos report from Standish, 50% of projects are challenged, whatever it is, 20% or so of projects that, outright fail, the rest, 30% and change that obviously are successful. So there's 3 areas we want to look at here that result in value loss, but also value delay or deferral. First, business value loss through outright project failures, right? When projects fail, you do not receive the value, right? It was interesting, the PMI turned around and said, look, around 40% of project failures out there are due to misalignment, right? So it ties back to that initial metric in the first place. I've seen many architectural stats too, saying that poor architecture or visibility into the architecture is one of the reasons for projects to be challenged or fail, right? So there's connective tissue, as I described before, between all of these things. So I said, look, low performing organizations, right? Around 16% of value is being lost due to outright failures. Then you have, the 50% of projects that Standish say are challenged, right? Budget overruns, cost overruns and schedule delays, right? Cost overruns results in value loss, right? Budget is finite at the portfolio level. So when you think about that, right, if I have to invest more in an existing project, then I have to descope another project or cut another project. It results in value being lost and even delayed, right? And so saying around 15%, and there are stats that say how many projects experience significant cost overruns. It is large still, right? Financial management needs to be better integrated with overall project execution. So it's around 15%. So between those two things, we've got another 31%. So 34% of value being left on the table. You won't even realize it was there. Now we have 31% of value being lost due to poor execution through outright failures and cost overruns. And then, of course, schedule delays, right? I'm not going to get into that. We know program management is not a perfect science. Project management is not a perfect science. There's going to be delays, right? At a minimum, that's deferring the value, right? Or delaying the value. And you expect the market conditions to be the same to be able to realize that value. Maybe there will be, maybe there won't be, right? So a lot of value is being delayed, right? So to me, I know there's a few metrics that are missing here. We're going to work with the community to build that out to make sure all those critical capabilities are well represented across strategic portfolio management all the way through to change management. We're touching on architecture here, but I think we can do a better job, right? But this is significant, right? And what's important about these leading indicator metrics is I can do something about these, right? It's not 70% of the investments are at risk of not delivering the results. I can't do much with that. It's opaque. Now I can start to drill in and say, if I fix this, value is going to flow. It's almost the plumbing analogy. We are leaking value through these leading indicator metrics. If we can fix the plumbing, we are going to get a better throughput of value and maximize that flow. Okay, so to me, that is probably the most important principle of the whole lot, right? From what I've done over the last 30 years, I've seen in organizations, it very seldomly do you get that executive commitment to drive the change top down. It often occurs in the middle of the organization, which goes laterally and tries to go up and does not get that necessary to get that support. So the C-suite understanding the criticality of this, understanding that it can be fixed, it doesn't have to be expensive. The first right step isn't big 4, big 5 to go and roll out some one-size-fits-all framework to do this. No. You've got to personalize that operating model, which leads into principle 2, establish a strategy execution operating model. By the way, last Thursday we had a community meeting, and this name is going to change slightly. I haven't had time to update the slides, but it changes real time, because the whole purpose of two is say, once you've got that C-suite commitment, they need to put their money where their mouth is and form an enterprise function, which we're calling a strategy execution office. Now, before everyone freaks out and says, not another governance function, etc., right? We're just calling it a strategy execution office because strategy execution needs to become a mission critical discipline. So there needs to be an office function, however it's structured, to be the champion of that. But I don't mind if it's called a transformation office, or it's called a strategic realization office, or it's called, I don't care what you call it, right? It's the mindset of this office that is important. It is the mindset of an office that needs to be, and I see Kim's on the call here, as he said in one of the meetings, the architects of strategy execution, right? The architects of strategy execution, who are going to be forensically focused on identifying those value leaks and fixing those, not worrying about the minutiae of all these different methodologies. I'm going to do agile task management. I'm going to do waterfall task management. It's all about value stream stage. No, let's focus on how this all comes together and where value is being lost between how these capabilities and teams are joined. And let's identify these leading indicator metrics that can be a barometer of success in terms of what we're doing. And from there, as a strategy execution office, their whole job is to unify the village, is to bring the different functions together, not all into that office. This is virtual teams, right? To be able to come in so they are represented to build a cohesive operating model that allows value to be optimized, through that process. So the job of the strategy execution office and the architects that exist within the strategy execution office, and there'll be program management, there will be business architecture expertise here, right, is to be able to define a capability improvement roadmap that unifies the village and brings together those critical capabilities to overcome or improve those leading indicator metrics to drive value. We don't want to wait to value to be hemorrhaged, right? We need to identify these leading indicator metrics that suggest if we fix that, we know the value throughput is going to be greater. This is not a one-time thing. This is a continuous, if we're developing the strategy execution muscle, think of this office as the fitness instructor, right? We don't just stop going to the gym. We continue working out to maintain whatever gains we made. So this is critical, right? But it's about lean governance. This isn't about we're going to create an enterprise PMO and put lots of structured paint by number governance. No, it's the minimal enterprise controls, embracing autonomy of execution and governance within the functions, but to get the multiplier effect of bringing the village together and unify or optimizing and integrating those key capabilities I mentioned earlier. Principle 3, and in my mind, another really, really important one. Again, we said alignment was a problem. So translate and communicate strategic direction, right? So we really need to do a better job as organizations in how we formulate strategy. Yes, this is part of this, but how we then take that strategy, translate and communicate it across the organization. So how do we set it? How do we decompose it? How do we align horizontally? How do we align vertically in the organization? How do we establish the key metrics to measure the strategy? How do we make, as Linda said in one other call, this omni-channel? So we're not just forcing strategy down people's throat. It's actually a bi-directional, sorry, I said it again, omnidirectional discussion in terms of setting strategy and defining strategy. And then how do we communicate effectively so everyone in the organization knows the strategic direction and provides that North Star? In my mind, this is done horribly badly in most organizations today. Obviously, there's pockets of excellence, right? And it isn't because balanced scorecard doesn't exist. It isn't because, whatever, OKRs is working or the new way of doing it is working or is not working. It isn't because Hoshin Kanri isn't great, right? There's lots of textbook techniques to do this, but what's working in reality, right? To me, it requires that C-suite commitment in the first place. This is owned by the strategy folks, but it's going to be driven by the operational people through the entire organization. Next one, which I think is going to be very relevant for this call, the map and optimize the organizational operating blueprint, right? Again, I want this to be as focused on the operational activity and spend in terms of alignment and execution as it is the discretionary activity and spend. So this is where architecture comes in. So we get that complete visibility of our current state architecture, both business and technical, probably business first, then technical, right? Well, to be able to ensure that target state architecture aligns with our strategy And in other words, is optimizing how we're going to execute in the future rather than living with that bloated environment, which is going to be like dragging an anchor in terms of how we execute. So to me, this is where I've always said business architecture and strategic portfolio management are two sides of the same coin. They are critical. One is not more important than the other. They need to come together, right? This is our opportunity to be able to elevate this to the C-suite level and say both disciplines are critical in terms of driving and reclaiming value. We don't need to get into the minutiae of how we prioritize, how we do task management, or how we structure that. That's going to be left in the engine room with these important disciplines. But we want to make sure these disciplines come together, or these functions come together to tell that value story, so we can solve this from both sides of the equation, both the operation activity and spend, as well as the discretionary activity and spend. And we're actually meeting on Thursday to dive deeper in a community meeting into this exact principle, which has already been fleshed out at a high level. Now, as we move into 5, capture and qualify all demand, right? As we'll see later in a slide, if we're deriving the work directly from the strategy, we know we're going to have the right initiatives, right? If we know that our architectural target state is set, relative to the strategy, we know that roadmap to get there is going to have the right initiatives, right? So now we just need a way of consolidating, and evaluating. And it's less about if we do these things anymore. It's more about when we do these things. And we'll get into that, right? And of course, we talked about alignment being a problem. We talked about, annual planning being a problem. I'll talk more about that in a second if there's time. But this next one, continuously optimize and activate the strategic roadmap. We now need to move to that continuous monthly, quarterly, whatever the time frame may be, of re-optimizing, rebalancing the portfolio to ensure we always have the right investments and we're getting the right bang for the buck or yield from these investments. And not just the easy stuff, or the easy stuff to me at least, the projects or the initiatives, but also the operational activity and spend too. So all this stuff has to come up now and surface in decision-making views, so we can make calls in terms of when to divest, when to invest, when to bring in something new, right? So this is critical, right? A lot of people talking about moving from annual planning to continuous planning, but it needs to be across all activity and spend. Now, I spent a lot of my 2010s building software that integrated financial management capabilities with project management and other aspects, right? To me, financial data is integral and it's key. So, and often I used to joke in the sales cycle when we were selling strategic portfolio management products and services, we're not getting anywhere and there's someone in finance who's starting to sweat, right? So this is owned by FP&A or the finance team, but we want to ensure that financial data is integral in everything we do, right? And I think there's a great opportunity here, and I'm getting maybe ahead of myself, putting the cart before the horse, right? To look at how we can build an overall enterprise cost model by, uniting architects with the finance, with the strategic portfolio people to build that enterprise cost model that can account for every dollar relative to the strategy of the organization. So yes, we want to ensure the finance team can do their job in terms of reconciliation and reporting for the street, but we also don't want that to impede our rolling wave plan in terms of forecasts across things, right? We need to move in terms of 6 to a more of a multi-year forecast, so that annual planning exercise just becomes, a quarterly exercise, not necessarily, down tools for 3 to 4 months ahead of the new calendar year. 8. Again, not necessarily my area of expertise, but this is where HR comes in, right? I strongly believe that to get strong alignment across the organization, we need to ensure that our incentive and commitment models are aligned with our strategy, right? Not disconnected from that. So yes, as part of build a workforce and culture for strategy execution, we're going to look at, do we have the right skills in the organization to do what we need to do? For sure we are. We're going to look at the capability, but how do we align our incentive models, right? How do we ensure that, culturally, people are excited and committed to executing on their strategy, which includes understanding the strategy, right? So how do we create that culture, and motivation and excitement for executing on a strategy? We talk at the forum about mastering the art and science of strategy execution. Science being the frameworks or plays, the art being the human dimension or human obstacles that we need to overcome. With 9, this is how we get into execution, empower execution and drive change. We're never going to say you got to do it waterfall, you got to do agile, right? It doesn't matter to us, right? Any forms of execution are going to be good as long as we stick within those minimal enterprise guardrails. We don't enforce any ways of working in terms of how teams execute, right? And we also want to ensure that change management is key within this too. And last but by no means least, establish a value realization discipline. If there are two bookends to this, having got C-suite commitment, having stood up the strategy execution office, the architects of this capability, it is translate and communicate strategy, and it is establish a value realization discipline, right? So this just builds to make that a discipline. So from the strategy, from the metrics we set up, now let's track and hold people accountable. Both of those things are done badly today. I think with C-suite backing can be done a lot better. But these are not just financial metrics. These are going to be operational metrics as well. So I know we're a little tight on time. So let's just say I'll try and get through this one quickly. A couple of minutes on this, right? Ultimately, when we think about what we're trying to do here, it is about maximization, acceleration of value, or value realization. And net, we are improving our overall portfolio planning and execution capabilities to be able to do a better job of strategy execution, right? Now, this slide may be a little bit biased based on my experiences coming more from the project program portfolio side of the house. But I often see organizations evolving their portfolio planning techniques, right? And so you'll find that, in poor performing organizations, and that low performing that I was referencing earlier in those leading indicator metrics, right? You'll see kind of a project driven approach, right? Which is based on annual planning, where strategy is loosely set at the corporate level. And then part of that annual planning process, projects are generated and teed up against the strategy, right? Or mapped into the strategy, and using maybe sophisticated optimization techniques, you figure out which ones you want to do to maximize the value of the entire portfolio. This is a methodology I was involved in building in 2002, right? We thought back then it was a top-down approach. It isn't. It's bottom-up. Strategy is defined loosely. Projects are mapped into the strategy. Use techniques to prioritize and optimize. You're selecting of the best of whatever's been proposed. Hence that opportunity cost, or that 26% of value being lost from your portfolio you weren't even aware of in the first place, because you've got the wrong projects in the mix, right? So that's the real frailty of this approach, is that it's bottom up versus top down. And again, the names are irrelevant here. Project driven, initiative, and enterprise driven. I've just given these names, but you can put whatever name you want on these approaches. So as we move to initiative driven, right, in this naming convention, we want to overcome that one frailty, which is being bottom up. It's where we deal with the better translation and communication of strategy, as we talked about in principle 3. How do we define and how do we break down and decompose strategy across the organization and set metrics? When you do that, as you decompose down, the initiatives and projects just fall off the bone, right? They are actionable activities or events based on the strategy and metric combination. So again, if you follow this decomposition down into the work, you have the right work identified, or the right initiatives identified. You don't know when you can do them, but you have the right initiatives identified, right? Now, at the same time, we want to move from that annual planning to a more continuous planning, where we're rebalancing the portfolio, because things happen. Variables change, internal, external, whatever. You're going to have to rebalance that portfolio to maintain that alignment, right? But the problem now is we're really doing a good job of just the discretionary activity and spend, right? We need a full enterprise picture, right? And that's where enterprise driven comes in, right? Where we want to integrate and introduce business and enterprise architecture best practices, right? So we have a full view of everything. So we come down from the strategy, we understand the current state, we set our target state, we know the transformation roadmap in terms of moving to our target state architecture based on having that visibility across our architecture. But that's not the only way this works, right? I can still derive initiatives directly from the strategy and look at their feasibility or validity relative to the architectural blueprint of the organization, right? Now, the benefit now is I have a view of all activity and spend, right? Because I'm bringing these disciplines and portfolios together. Now, I often present this as kind of like a evolution. It isn't, right? Because ultimately enterprise driven is a superset of all, right? Because as I said, we can derive the work directly from the strategy and assess against the architectural blueprint. We can structure our architecture relative to the strategy and the target state and derive our work directly from that. And we're always going to have out of left field project demand, which is what project driven is, right? And now we have a broader environment to assess its validity. Is it strategically aligned or relevant? Is it architecturally compliant or relevant? Anyway, don't worry about the names. I'm not even suggesting the approaches here either. I mean, there's many different approaches to achieve enterprise driven, but the kind of guardrails to what we're trying to achieve, and most organizations are moving in this direction. It's just normally in a disconnected manner. When I used to ask people, where are you today? It was somewhere between project driven and initiative driven, because I was invariably speaking to the sort of program portfolio people, right? But they said, but I know people in architecture are working on that enterprise driven thing, right? But the reality is we all need to come together to build that enterprise driven approach. Okay, so listen, I know I kept that super high level, right? But we are, first and foremost, as a community, we are defining these universal standards of excellence, these principles that we're going to then say we must achieve these by bringing the people together and unifying or integrating and optimizing those critical capabilities. Having done that, and we're not too far away from that, we're going to kind of open things up and say, now let's identify the plays, the best practices that folks are using out there to achieve these. Safe for the knowledge that there's many rights. There's still going to be some wrongs, but there's going to be many rights. We're rejecting the one size fits all. There's going to be different ways to achieve, translate, and communicate strategic direction. Yes, you could do it balanced scorecard. Yes, you could do it OKRs. Yes, you could do it with Hoshin Kanri. Yes, you could do it with a pick and mix, which just works for this organization, right? So this is where it gets exciting to me, where we're going to develop this crowdsourced playbook of battle-tested approaches being used across geographies, across industries, right? Ratified by the different functions that represent that village, right? And work together to figure out how to build that cohesive operating model, right? Which brings the teams together. The teams still are going to break into their own silos and do their work and optimize things for their world. But how do we establish the minimal controls that ensures that these teams are perfectly adjoining and value is not being lost, at the seams? So I think that's probably it from me. Sorry, I picked up the pace a little bit towards the back end there, but obviously some time for questions. I kept this purposely at a high level. Good to see some familiar faces from the strategy execution on the call, right? If you're interested in the forum, please join. Say Linda's part of it, and we're going to try and ensure that the architecture teams and other teams play well in the sandbox together.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ben. And thank you, everybody, for joining. I don't see any questions into our chat, but this was such good information. We are going to have invite Ben back for a more one-on-one interview in our podcast called The Practice Exchange, where we'll dive into some pragmatic examples of how practitioners and teams can start realizing and doing things that Ben is pulling out here. So really appreciate your time. We'll make all of this information, the recording and the contents that was shared, available on our website. So if you aren't following us already, please feel free to follow us on LinkedIn, where you're going to get notifications of events or other things that might be happening here. Before we close out, I just want to give Linda one more chance if you wanted to do or let our members know anything before we sign off.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. Thanks, Ben. Great walkthrough. This has been really exciting work, you guys. And the fact that you're sitting in a business architecture echo chamber, perhaps, is really, really important. So a lot of the things that business architects bring to organizations when business architecture has a chance to provide value and institutionalize within the organization will address some of these things. So I'm inviting business architects to get involved in this. Anyone that wants to know more about it, wants to get in touch with me, business architects and enterprise architects, but especially business architects with this whole alignment to strategy. So I'm super interested in that. We are going to be, we need to be present in this conversation. So I'm inviting you there. There are a lot of things going on in BAF and TCBF and now in Houston. So please check our website and keep up with our events.